There are steps that are very significant. That last step in a marathon, crossing the finish line, much more significant than any of the other 40,000 or so along the way. That fatal missing of a step in a staircase, causing you to fall over, could prove to be very significant. Probably not in a good way. Sometimes a single step can even be historical for all of humanity. Try stepping out onto the moon for the first time. Talk about a significant step. Just make sure you're not number 2 out of the rocket, then much fewer will care. Back here on Earth, a step can sometimes be all that differs between the richest and the poorest in society. Following the extreme urbanism that humans went through in the 1800s up until now. Today, in many places of the world, all that differs between skyscrapers and butlers on one side and lawlessness and poor sanitation on the other is just one single step. This is a story about how slums came to define city development. At night, the policemen would only come through the street 2 together. It was a fairly rackety place. And yet amid the noise and dirt lived the usual, respectable French shopkeepers, bakers and laundresses and the like. It was quite a representative Paris slum. The words of George Orwell about the Paris slums in the 1930s is not a bad summary of what slums are. They are complex. They are dense. They are to some extent informal. Slums exist mostly in places that have recently urbanized. Slums were commonplace in Europe and the US and Japan not long ago. Nowadays we associate them with the current emerging low and middle income economies. There, the urbanization process is often much faster than we ever saw in the West. Part of the explanation for that is that the people trying to escape poverty today do so in a globalized world, much more than was true 100 years ago. Now farmers in rural Tanzania and Haiti compete with their harvests on a global market. And that is understandably quite difficult and pushes many to move to the urban areas, where economic and social prospects are much greater. The fact that they establish themselves in slums is quite obvious because they can't afford anything else. Slums are cheaper because they are informal. And in most places, formal means fairly good access to services, informal does not. Slums have a much harder time establishing in richer nations, not because there could never be enough poor inhabitants, but because regulation and oversight is so much better. In some nations, 80 to 90% of the urban population could be considered living in slums. But it is difficult to define what exactly qualifies as slums. Of course, at times, slums aren't torn down, but evolve over time to integrate with the surrounding city, passing through stages that are more of grey areas in between slums and non-slums. It should of course also be noted that many poor people in low and middle income nations live in proper buildings and not in areas that could be defined as slums. From the perspective of inhabitants of affluent neighborhoods, especially in richer nations, where slum living just isn't a reality a couple of generations back, slum life can be hard to grasp. Why someone would choose to live such an exposed, vulnerable life, fighting hard for every dollar earned on the bottommost step of the labor ladder of the city. But for most slum dwellers, life in the slums is a significant step up from the rural alternative. Cities in emerging economies can provide good opportunities also for the poorest. Cities that have a large poor population can be better for the poor to live in. There they are under less pressure than if they constitute a minority. Governments are in general better at battling urban poverty than rural poverty. At least they seem to prefer to focus on it. But slum living is no doubt difficult. It is often associated with living in areas with poor housing and a lack of services. Slums often have among the highest population densities on the planet, poor sanitation and bad access to clean water. It often also involves great distances on foot or public transportation to work and services. Crime levels are often higher in slum areas and policing can be limited. In slums, the risk of disease is higher as a result of the poor access to healthcare, a high population density and proximity to industries and poorly handled waste. The lack of proper housing also leads to the inhabitants being very vulnerable to natural disasters like storms, floods and earthquakes, both during the direct impact but also during the recovery phase. Often inhabitants of slums, much like poor people in general, are forced to pay premiums for basic services because they cannot buy in bulk or because they do not have services provided through government-funded infrastructure. Buying bottled water is more expensive almost everywhere than having it on tap. Women and children are also hit the hardest by having to work in the informal sector, where legal protection is lacking. People who live in slums do so on borrowed time. They almost never own the land that they live on. And even if it's public land and you aren't under the risk of a private landlord driving you away, it's only a matter of time before the officials chooses to do something with that piece of land. Either because they have a genuine need for it, or because that international conference or sporting event is a great excuse to clean up the city. There are many instances throughout history where cities by brute force cleared and tore down slums, not the least as a measure to hide poverty and inadequate services from international eyes. Overpopulation is a commonly heard term, but it rarely targets rich people. It seems the only ones that can be responsible for overpopulation are poor. Some of the more extreme cases of slums are also the results of colonialism. Europeans only focusing their efforts on one large city created a high demand for being a part of that very geographically centralized economy. In other places, extreme density can be caused by geographical or political effort, where mountains or zoning laws keep poor dwellers in extremely concentrated areas. There are also many places in the world where slums are very ethnically segregated compared to the more affluent areas. From the perspective of the prosperous, from the middle class and the rich, especially in richer nations halfway around the world, slums seem to be frozen in time. When other areas around them develop, they are stuck in fighting for the basic necessities, unable to take that necessary step in the right direction. And in a way this is true, as we have seen. But on an individual level, slums are not necessarily a place you remain in. Many are the people who move into slums, and when they can afford to, move out of them to more permanent housing in formal areas. Many are the people who also move into slums when terms are hard on surrounding rural areas, and then move back when circumstances are better again. There are for sure many people who live their whole lives in slums, no doubt, but slums also host people on the move. They host migrants who house there for a time and then move on. And slums themselves move on, one step at a time. Sure, sometimes it's done by excavators, but many are the affluent areas in cities all around the world with a history as a slum. Slowly but surely slums can improve, expanding services, investing in proper housing, increasing economic and social opportunity, supporting the mobility both in and out of these areas. And that one great step, moving out of the slum, could be of utter importance to the individual. That one single step into the formal economy. Thank you for watching.